Story 1. This story is about my first experience living alone in a small bachelor apartment in the city. It wasn't much, just a cramped space in a building that looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades. But it was cheap, and that was all that mattered at the time. The landlord seemed nice, but there was something about him that always put me on edge, like he was hiding something. I settled in quickly, unpacking my things and getting used to the creaky floors and ancient pipes that groaned in the middle of the night. But there was one thing about the place that always bothered me. The walls. They were thin. Not just thin in the usual way, but they felt wrong. Almost like they weren't solid at all, but like something was hidden inside them. The first night I spent there was quiet, except for the usual sounds of the building settling. I didn't think much of it, but the next night was different. As I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard it. A faint whisper. It was so soft, I almost thought it was in my head. But then I heard it again, this time clearer. "Help me!" I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I knew I was alone. There was no one else in the apartment. The voice didn't come from anywhere specific, but I could have sworn it was coming from the walls. I chalked it up to being overtired and went back to sleep. The next few days were uneventful, but that night, the whispers started again. This time, it was different. It wasn't just a single voice. There were multiple voices, all speaking at once, low and frantic, like they were trying to get my attention. "Get out! Please, help me. It's too late." I covered my ears with my pillow, trying to block it out, but it didn't help. The voices grew louder, coming from every direction. It felt like the walls were alive, closing in on me, and I could barely breathe. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the apartment. The voices hadn't stopped, but they were quieter, almost like they were waiting for something. I decided to go to the landlord's office and ask about the history of the place, just to put my mind at ease. When I mentioned the whispers, his face turned pale. "No one's ever really stayed long in that apartment," he said, his voice shaking. "There's a history there. The previous tenant, he was a quiet guy, always kept to himself. But one night he went missing. We found his apartment in disarray, but there was no sign of a struggle. The police never figured out what happened to him." I was unsettled, but I didn't think much of it. I wanted to believe it was just the building's creaks and noises playing tricks on me. But later that night, when I lay in bed, the whispers came again. But this time, they were clearer than before. "He's still here." My blood ran cold. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the door, but as I reached for the handle, I heard the faintest footsteps from behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The whispering grew louder, and I realized it was coming from inside the walls. Not just the apartment, but the entire building. It was like someone or something was trapped in the walls, trying to get out. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things and left that night, not bothering to tell the landlord. I moved into a new place the next day, but every time I walk past that building, I swear I hear whispers, like they're calling my name. Story 2. This story is about when I moved into a small bachelor apartment in a rundown but affordable building. It was one of those places that had character, a creaky wooden floor, slightly peeling wallpaper, and a strange little locked door in the corner of the living room. The landlord had mentioned it during the tour. "Oh, that's just an old storage space," he said, waving it off. "It's been sealed for years. No key for it anymore." I didn't think much of it at the time. A locked door in an old apartment wasn't exactly unusual. The first few weeks were fine. I settled in, got used to the quirks of the place, noisy pipes, thin walls, and the faint scent of dampness that seemed to linger no matter how much I cleaned. But one night, I woke up to a sound, tap, tap, tap. At first, thought it was coming from the window, maybe a tree branch. But when I sat up, I realized the sound wasn't from outside. It was coming from inside the apartment, specifically from the locked door. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the building settling. But the tapping continued, growing more rhythmic, almost purposeful. It stopped just as suddenly as it started, and I told myself it was nothing. The next night, it happened again. Only this time, it wasn't just tapping. It sounded like faint whispers, so faint I couldn't make out any words. I sat on the couch, staring at the locked door, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But then the doorknob rattled. I froze. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out the noise. The rattling stopped, but then I heard a single thud, like something heavy had hit the door from the other side. The next morning, I called the landlord, demanding to know more about the locked room. He sounded annoyed. "It's just an old storage closet. Nothing's in there, probably just the pipes." But the sounds kept coming, every night without fail. The tapping, the whispers, the thuds. I started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. One night, I worked up the courage to inspect the door. I pressed my ear against it, trying to hear what was inside. That's when I felt it. The faintest, coldest breeze seeping through the crack. Desperate for answers, I asked one of my neighbors about the apartment. She hesitated, then leaned in close. "That door, it's not just storage. The guy who lived there before you was obsessed with it. He swore something was trying to get out." I laughed nervously, but she didn't. "He kept journals, you know, said he'd hear voices calling his name. The landlord found them when he disappeared." That night, I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a hammer and a flashlight, I decided to break the lock and see what was inside. As I approached the door, the tapping started again. Louder this time, more insistent. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I raised the hammer. But before I could strike, the doorknob started turning. Slowly, deliberately. I stumbled back, dropping the hammer. The door creaked open an inch, and all the noise stopped. The darkness inside the room felt alive, pressing against me like a heavy fog. And then I saw it. A single hand, pale and thin, reaching out from the shadows. I didn't wait to see more. I grabbed my keys, ran out of the apartment, and never went back. I left all my belongings behind, even my wallet. A few months later, I heard that the building was condemned. They tore it down. But sometimes I wonder, what happened to that room, and whatever was inside it? Story 3. This story is about my experience when I first moved into a bachelor apartment after graduating from college. I had found a cozy little place in the older part of the city, a small one-bedroom with a tiny kitchen and a living space that overlooked a quiet street. The rent was cheap, and the landlord seemed nice enough. Everything seemed perfect at first. It wasn't long after I moved in that I started noticing strange things. At first they were small, things I could easily brush off as forgetfulness or my imagination. Like how I'd leave the bathroom light on and return to find it switched off, or how the chairs at the dining table were never quite where I left them. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone moving around in the kitchen, but when I'd get up to check, there was nothing, just the stillness of my empty apartment. But then, one night, it all changed. I'd been out with friends celebrating the end of a long work week. When I got home around 1 a.m., I was exhausted but happy. I didn't think much of it when I noticed the lights were on in the living room. I must have left them on when I rushed out earlier, I thought. But as I entered, something felt off. The air was colder than usual, and the room was unnervingly quiet. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I shrugged it off and went to bed. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock. knock, knock, knock on my bedroom door. My heart stopped for a moment. I thought maybe it was a neighbor or someone playing a prank, but it didn't sound like that. It was too slow, too controlled, and it came from the inside of the room. I lay there, frozen, staring at the door, listening. The knocking continued for several seconds, then stopped. I sat up in bed, my breath shallow, trying to make sense of it. "It's nothing," I told myself. "I'm just tired." I got up and checked the door. It was locked from the inside. There was no one on the other side. No one had even been in the apartment. I double-checked all the windows. They were secure. I tried to convince myself I was just hearing things. The next few days were uneventful, until one night when I was watching TV on the couch. I felt the same chill in the air, the same feeling of being watched. I shrugged it off as the drafts in the old building. But then I saw something in the corner of my eye. A figure standing near the kitchen doorway, just out of sight. I turned my head quickly, but no one was there. A week later, things escalated. I came home after work to find my apartment in complete disarray. Books and papers scattered across the floor, as if someone had gone through them. I had no idea how it had happened, but I was the only one with a key. I called the landlord, who assured me that there had been no maintenance or anyone else coming into the apartment. I spent the night with the lights on, the door locked, and my phone in hand, ready to call for help if needed. As I lay there, wide awake, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone whispering. Not loud, but clear enough to make out the words. "Get out, leave this place." It was a woman's voice, soft but urgent. I immediately grabbed my phone and turned on all the lights. My apartment was empty. I stood in the middle of the living room, feeling as though I were suffocating under the weight of something unseen. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things and left, not even bothering to finish the lease. When I was leaving, the landlord mentioned in passing that there had been a prior tenant, a woman who had lived in the apartment for several years before mysteriously disappearing. No one knew what had happened to her, but rumors swirled that she'd been involved in some kind of ritual or spiritual practices. It was rumored that she had disappeared after something went wrong. I'll never forget that apartment. Sometimes I wonder if the woman ever really left, or if she's still there, waiting for someone else to move in just like I did.